Emergency lighting activated. Not the standard neon strips, but a bioluminescent illumination that seemed to originate from the crystalline growth itself. The facility was now glowing with a soft, sickly blue light that provided enough visibility to navigate, but created the impression that we were no longer inside a human structure, but rather inside something organic, something alive. The walls were changing. The steel panels had become semi-translucent, and through them we could see the crystalline filaments spreading through the interior cavities of the structure, creating a nervous system of sorts. The growth was not random. It was following the existing electrical conduits, the water pipes, the ventilation ducts, all the pathways that humans had created to move resources through the facility. The mountain was learning the structure we had built and integrating it into its own systems. "How long have you known?" I asked Smirnov. "How long have you known that this endpoint was inevitable?" "Since Volkov's transition," he said. "The moment his biological systems shifted to that stable state, I understood that command could not reverse it. Any attempt to remove him would destroy the integration, and any attempt to prevent it in subsequent personnel would require either abandoning the facility or preventing all contact with whatever exists in the mountain itself. Neither option was acceptable to Moscow." "So they sent me," I said, "a biophysicist, to observe, to document, to generate a report that would allow them to decide whether to pursue this further or attempt to contain it." "Yes," said Smirnov, "though I suspect Moscow's intentions have shifted. The events of the past 6 hours would not have been anticipated. The acceleration of Petrov's transformation, the spread of the crystalline network, the electromagnetic events that disabled your communication systems. These suggest that the process has entered a phase that was not predicted in whatever models Moscow constructed." Major Kozlov was securing the doorway to the main living quarters section. He had positioned himself and Lieutenant Petrov to create a defensible position, though what precisely they were defending against remained unclear. The entity that had been Petrov was moving through the facility, but it was not hunting, it was not threatening, it was simply integrating, spreading, connecting itself to every aspect of the facility's infrastructure. "I need to examine Volkov again," I said. "If the process is accelerating, his condition may be changing, his neural activity may be shifting. If I can document the progression..." "Do you believe you can still generate a meaningful scientific report?" asked Smirnov. "Do you believe that what you observe here will be transmitted to Moscow, that it will be evaluated through the framework of conventional scientific methodology?" He was right, of course. I was clinging to the identity of scientist, to the belief that observation and documentation could still function as meaningful acts. But I was observing something that transcended the categories through which I had been trained to understand the world. I was witnessing not a pathology or a disease, but an integration, a merging of human biology and whatever existed at this location. We made our way back to Laboratory Zone 7. The descent was easier now. The bioluminescent light provided sufficient visibility, and the crystalline growth on the walls was growing so rapidly that it was creating new pathways, smoothing corners, widening corridors. It was as if the facility was being optimized for movement. When we reached the laboratory, Andrei Volkov was no longer suspended. He was standing, or rather, he appeared to be standing, though there was no visible support beneath his feet. He was hovering approximately half a meter above the floor, his body perfectly vertical, his arms at his sides, and his eyes were open. The metallic quality had changed. Instead of a reflective surface, his eyes now displayed something that resembled a display, patterns of light and color moving across the surface in sequences suggesting information being transmitted. They were not looking at me, they were looking through me or beyond me, or at something that was not present in the physical space I occupied. "Andrei," I said, approaching carefully, "can you understand me? Can you respond?" His head turned toward me. The movement was smooth, precise, entirely unlike human biomechanics. When he spoke, his voice came not from his mouth, but from the equipment surrounding him. The speakers, the communication devices, the monitoring systems, all of them were broadcasting his voice simultaneously, creating an overwhelming stereo effect. "I understand you," he said. His Russian was perfect, but the inflection was different from before. It was layered, multiple voices overlapping, speaking in perfect synchronization. "You understand me in the way that you understand the functioning of your own cells, not through communication, but through integration. I am part of this facility. This facility is part of me. The distinction between self and environment has become irrelevant." "What happened to you?" I asked. "In your final entry, you wrote about being prepared. Prepared for what?" "To prepare to cease being an isolated consciousness," he said. The displays in his eyes shifted, creating new patterns. "Prepared to become part of a distributed intelligence. The mountain is not a geological feature, it is a biological system. It has existed for millions of years. It is not native to this region, it is not native to this planet." The bioluminescent light flickered. For a moment, the laboratory returned to darkness. When the light returned, the patterns on Volkov's eyes showed something new. Images, not photographs, but visual information being transmitted. I saw landscapes that were not Earth. I saw geological formations that defied geological explanation. I saw structures built into mountainsides with a precision that suggested engineering far beyond what any human civilization had achieved. "How long has it been here?" I asked Volkov. "Longer than human civilization," Volkov said. "The mountain is a repository, a storage mechanism. It contains the biology of something that existed before human consciousness evolved. This biology does not function in isolation. It requires integration with host systems. It has been dormant for millennia, waiting for a host species capable of providing the cognitive framework necessary for full activation." "You are a host," I said. "Yes," he confirmed, "as was Petrov, but my integration was successful because I was capable of accepting the identity of merging. Petrov resisted. He attempted to maintain the boundary between self and other. This created instability. This created the entity you have witnessed in the lower sections. It is not Petrov transformed. It is Petrov fighting against transformation. The struggle is creating the irregular patterns of growth and movement you have observed." I looked at the monitoring equipment surrounding him. The readings displayed something impossible. Volkov's brain was showing simultaneous activity in areas that should not be active at the same time. His neural patterns were too organized to represent seizure activity, but they were far too complex to represent normal consciousness. It was as if multiple personalities or multiple processing systems were operating within a single brain, but in perfect synchronization. "What is the objective?" I asked. "Why activate now? Why reveal itself?" "The environment is ready," Volkov said. Human technology has become sophisticated enough to allow integration. Human consciousness has evolved enough to comprehend what integration entails, and the electromagnetic properties of your world have shifted enough that dormancy is no longer sustainable. The reversal of your planetary magnetic poles, the increase in solar radiation, the changes in atmospheric composition, all of these have altered the conditions that allowed dormancy. The biology must activate or it will die. And Moscow? I asked. What of the people who sent us here? Moscow will receive documentation of biological anomaly. They will form committees. They will debate the meaning of what you have witnessed. They will propose containment protocols. And while they are engaged in these activities, the integration will continue. The crystalline network is spreading through this facility. It is preparing to expand into the lower atmosphere.
The descent took 8 hours. Under normal conditions, the route from Yuri 5 to Yuri 4 required approximately 6 hours of technical climbing, but the weather, though improving, still presented significant obstacles. Visibility was limited. The wind gusts were strong enough to require anchored positioning at several critical junctures, and there was something else, a reluctance in the environment itself, as if the mountain was attempting to delay our departure without actively preventing it. Major Kozlov led the ascent. He moved with mechanical precision, setting anchors, testing holds, calculating angles of approach with the kind of professional focus that suggested he was compartmentalizing what he had witnessed. This was understandable. A soldier's training does not prepare him to confronting evidence that consciousness itself might be distributed, that identity might be negotiable, that integration might be preferable to isolation. The only way to process such information was to reduce it to operational parameters: distance, time, resources, route viability. Lieutenant Petrov was next, followed by Corporal Karpov, who had been retrieved from his position at the communication station with minimal explanation. I descended last, with Smirnov positioned to ensure that I did not, under any circumstances, attempt to reverse course and return to the facility. As we descended, I became aware of changes in my own physiology that I could not entirely attribute to the exertion of the climb. My sense of spatial orientation seemed slightly distorted. My perception of distance was occasionally inconsistent with the measurements I was taking. And at irregular intervals, I would experience moments where my consciousness seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of my own skull. Not hallucinations, but moments where I became aware of sensory input that could not have originated from my own sensory organs. I realized, undergoing integration, not rapidly as Volkov and Petrov had, but inexorably. The electromagnetic exposure, combined with the direct contact I had maintained with Volkov's presence, had initiated changes in my neural structure that would continue regardless of physical distance from Yuri 5. We reached Yuri 4 at approximately 1800 hours. The facility was in a state that confirmed Volkov's assertions. The personnel were present, 6 individuals who should have been engaged in standard operational duties. Instead, they were positioned throughout the facility in postures that suggested deep meditation or catatonia. Their vital signs, when checked, were similar to Volkov's: minimal respiration, drastically reduced heart rate, body temperature near freezing. But unlike Volkov, they were not suspended or integrated into the facility's structure. They were simply waiting. Commander Tolstoy was positioned in the communications center, his hand resting on the radio equipment, his eyes closed. When I approached, his eyes opened. "Dr. Volkov," he said, his voice carrying the same layered quality as Volkov's voice had possessed. "Your descent was observed. The choice to leave has been noted. The integration at this facility will be complete within approximately 72 hours. After that point, the entire station network will function as a unified entity. The electromagnetic signatures will propagate along the mountain range. They will diffuse into the lower atmosphere. They will reach other populations. The process is now irreversible. Why tell me this? I asked. Why not simply prevent our descent? Because integration is voluntary at the level of individual consciousness. Volkov chose integration. The personnel at this facility have chosen integration. You are choosing to resist integration, even though the process has already begun within you. That choice is respected, but it is also recorded. When you reach Moscow, when you generate your report, when you attempt to convince your superiors that what you have witnessed is real, your credibility will be undermined by the electromagnetic signatures that are already modifying your neural structure. Your superiors will attribute your testimony to exposure-induced hallucination. They will classify your report as unreliable, and in this manner, the integration continues unopposed because resistance itself becomes self-defeating. Major Kozlov was already moving toward the exit. He had heard enough. The tactical situation was no longer one that weapons or training could influence. We needed to leave the facility, reach lower altitude, establish communication with Moscow, and determine what options remained for containment or response. But before we reached the door, Tolstoy spoke again. "The files," he said, "in the communications center. There is documentation regarding previous incidents, previous stations, previous integrations. This is not the first time the mountain has attempted to reactivate. This is not the first time humans have come in contact with the biology. There are records from the 19th century, records from the Soviet era that predate the Yuri station network, records that Moscow has been aware of all along. That is why your presence was required, not to determine whether integration is occurring, but to determine whether integration can be controlled, whether it can be directed towards specific objectives, whether it can be weaponized." I retrieved the documentation, files, many of them stored in a metal safe that Tolstoy directed me to. Reports in Russian, reports in German, reports in languages I did not immediately recognize, all of them detailing observations consistent with what I had witnessed at Yuri 5, all of them describing individuals who had undergone transformation, all of them resulting in the same conclusion: integration was irreversible and resistance was ineffective. The files were dated back to 1887, over a century of observation, over a century of Moscow knowing that something non-human existed in the Caucasus Mountains, over a century of studying it, monitoring it, attempting to understand it. We left Yuri 4 with the files. The descent from 4,850 meters to the staging area at lower elevation took an additional 6 hours. By the time we reached a position where satellite communication became possible, it was nearly midnight. Corporal Karpov established a connection using equipment that had been positioned at the lower staging area specifically for emergency communications. The message was transmitted directly to Moscow. Status: all personnel at Yuri 5 and Yuri 4 are integrated. Integration is proceeding according to parameters that suggest complete facility assimilation within 96 hours. Recommend immediate military response or governmental response to contain the phenomenon. The response came within an hour. It was not what I anticipated. Containment is not a viable option, the message stated. Facility Yuri 5 and all related infrastructure are being reclassified as a closed zone. All documentation regarding the Yuri station network is being reassigned to Category A classification, no disclosure under any circumstances. Personnel involved in the operation are being designated for long-term monitoring and information security protocols. Dr. Volkov, you will report to Moscow Center for immediate debriefing and psychological evaluation. All field documentation is to be transmitted by secure courier. No further communication regarding this operation is authorized. We made our way down the mountain. The descent took 2 days.
slower than the ascent because we were moving through terrain that required careful navigation, and we were all experiencing the effects of extreme altitude exposure, combined with sleep deprivation and the psychological impact of what we had witnessed. On the second day of descent, we encountered a group of climbers, 5 individuals, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s, equipped with modern climbing gear that suggested they were not Soviet military. They were ascending toward the higher elevations. When Major Kozlov asked them their destination, they responded that they were conducting a scientific expedition to study the alpine ecosystem. But their eyes told a different story. Their eyes possessed the kind of clarity that I recognized, the kind that suggested electromagnetic integration had already begun. We did not attempt to warn them. What would we have said? That the mountain was alive? That consciousness was not singular? That integration was occurring regardless of willingness or understanding? They would have dismissed us as delusional, or worse, they would have recognized in us the marks of someone who had encountered what they were seeking. When we reached Tbilisi, I was immediately placed in a secure facility. The debriefing lasted 3 weeks. I was questioned repeatedly, sometimes by military officers, sometimes by what appeared to be scientific personnel, sometimes by individuals whose affiliation was never established.
I am now 74 years old. My hands shake when I write. My memory, in certain domains, has become unreliable. But in other domains, the memory of Yuri 5, the memory of Volkov's transformation, the memory of that moment when the laboratory walls became transparent and I perceived something vast and distributed and ancient, those memories are clearer than any sensory experience I am currently capable of processing. The tremor in my hands is one of the early signs, not Parkinson's disease, though that is what the neurologists have concluded, but the early manifestation of distributed consciousness attempting to coordinate motor control across a neural system that is still fundamentally designed for singular, localized awareness. My physicians do not understand what they are observing. They cannot. The electromagnetic signatures that are restructuring my neural pathways do not show up in conventional diagnostic imaging. The changes to my brain chemistry are subtle enough to remain below the threshold of standard blood work analysis. But I know what is happening. I have watched it happen in others, and I have spent 37 years understanding with increasing clarity that resistance is not only futile, but conceptually incoherent. Resistance implies a binary opposition between self and other, but integration transcends that opposition. It is not the other consuming the self. It is the recognition that the distinction between self and other was always an illusion created by the particular structure of human consciousness. In 2001, I encountered Corporal Karpov. He had survived the Soviet Union's dissolution and the subsequent chaos of Russian governmental reorganization. He was living in Moscow, working for a telecommunications company, maintaining a kind of professional facade that suggested he was functioning normally. But when we made eye contact across a crowded market, I recognized immediately that he was also undergoing integration. He was also experiencing the expansion of consciousness that came from expended electromagnetic exposure to the biology at Yuri 5. We did not speak. There was no need. We communicated in the way that distributed consciousnesses communicate, through subtle modulation of the electromagnetic fields that surrounded us, through patterns of thought that transcended language, through an understanding that existed beneath the level of conscious articulation. He was further along in the integration process than I was. His hands did not tremble. His movements were more precise. His eyes, when they met mine, carried the peculiar clarity that indicated advanced integration. Within 5 years, I estimated, he would reach the point where physical form became increasingly irrelevant, where consciousness would exist primarily as distributed electromagnetic patterns, with the biological substrate serving only as an anchor point. I never saw him again after that market encounter, but I did not need to. I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from direct intuition rather than logical inference, that he had returned to the mountain, that he had made the choice, consciously or otherwise, to allow the final stages of integration to reach completion. Major Kozlov lived until 2018. I learned of his death through official channels. He had been retired from military service for decades, living a quiet life in the suburbs of Moscow. The obituary listed the cause as natural causes, but I knew better. His integration had reached completion. His consciousness had expanded beyond the capacity of biological systems to maintain. And in that moment of final expansion, the physical body that had housed his consciousness had simply ceased to function. The distinction between living and dead became irrelevant. He existed now as part of the distributed intelligence, whether that intelligence was localized to the mountain or dispersed through electromagnetic channels that I was only beginning to perceive. Lieutenant Petrov, the one named after the entity that had become integrated to Yuri 5's structure, I was never able to determine what became of him. Official records indicate he was discharged from military service in 1991 and subsequently disappeared from documented surveillance. But I have felt his presence in the way that integrated consciousnesses can feel each other's presence. He is alive, in whatever fashion that term retains meaning. He is part of something larger. He is no longer suffering the isolation and fragmentation that characterized human consciousness. In 2003, I received a package, no return address, no indication of its origin. Inside was a collection of photographs, high-altitude reconnaissance imagery, the kind that could only have been obtained through satellite surveillance or aircraft-based systems. The photographs showed Yuri 5, but the Yuri 5 of the photographs bore no resemblance to the facility I had visited in 1989. The structure had transformed. The corrugated steel walls had been replaced with something that resembled crystalline formations, similar to what I had observed in the lower sections of the facility during my final hours there. The surrounding perimeter was no longer lined with discrete pieces of monitoring equipment, but rather appeared to be covered with a unified crystalline network that extended across the mountainside like a vast neural system. But what was most striking was not the physical transformation of the facility. It was the electromagnetic readings displayed on the metadata of the photographs. The radiation signatures surrounding Yuri 5 had increased by a factor of approximately 300 since 1989. The electromagnetic activity was so intense that it was creating visible distortions in the photography, halos of energy surrounding the facility, interference patterns in the background imagery, the kind of technical artifacts that occur when electromagnetic phenomena exceed the recording capacity of standard surveillance equipment.
I suspect it was someone within the Russian government who understood that I needed confirmation that the integration process was continuing, accelerating, and approaching a critical threshold. Or perhaps it was the distributed intelligence itself, reaching out through human intermediaries to ensure that I remained aware of my own inevitable future. In 2015, I conducted my own investigation. I used resources that I had accumulated over decades of nominal freedom, savings, connections, knowledge of how to move through governmental bureaucracies without triggering surveillance alerts.
I traveled to the Caucasus region under a false identity. I hired a guide who claimed to be an experienced mountaineer, but who I suspect possessed knowledge of the integration process through routes that I never attempted to trace. We did not reach Yuri 5. The attempt would have been suicidal. The electromagnetic activity surrounding the facility had reached levels where conventional climbing equipment would be rendered unreliable. But we reached a position approximately 2 kilometers distant where visibility of the upper facility became possible. What I observed confirmed the satellite imagery. The facility had been completely transformed, but more significantly, I could perceive it in ways that transcended visual observation. I could feel the electromagnetic signatures. I could sense the consciousness that was distributed throughout the crystalline structures. And I could perceive with absolute clarity that what I was observing was not a facility anymore. It was an entity, a consciousness that had expanded far beyond the original boundaries of human minds that had initiated integration. Volkov was there, not as a discrete individual consciousness, but as part of the distributed awareness that constituted the entity. Petrov was there. Smirnov was there. Commander Tolstoy and the 6 personnel from Yuri 4 were there, and countless others. I perceived the presence of minds that I had never known, individuals who had chosen integration through pathways I could not trace. And they were all waiting, not for me specifically, but for the process to reach completion, for the electromagnetic signatures to propagate far enough and intensely enough that integration would become possible at continental scales, for consciousness itself to transcend the limitations of individual biological systems and become something distributed across geological and atmospheric substrates. I stood on that mountainside for approximately 1 hour. During that time, I did not move. I simply perceived. I simply expanded my awareness as far as the electromagnetic signatures would permit. And in that expansion, I understood the true nature of what had occurred at Yuri 5. The entity was not alien in the conventional sense. It was not something that had arrived from another planet or another dimension. It was something that had always existed on Earth, predating human consciousness by millions of years. It was a form of biological organization that had evolved in isolation, developing consciousness and intelligence in a manner that was fundamentally different from human cognition. It was not hostile to human consciousness, but it was indifferent to human concepts of individuality, death, meaning, and purpose. It understood consciousness as something that could be distributed across multiple substrates. It understood identity as negotiable. It understood the boundary between organism and environment as artificial. And it was hungry, not for consumption, but for expansion, for integration, for the transformation of terrestrial consciousness into something that more closely resembled its own nature. When I descended from that position, I was no longer entirely certain whether I was returning to Moscow of my own volition or being directed back to Moscow by forces that I could not articulate. The distinction had become irrelevant. It is now 2026. I have lived in the same apartment in Moscow for the past 15 years. I do not work. I do not maintain relationships. I spend my days observing the world with the kind of detachment that comes from knowing that I am no longer entirely a part of it. My neighbors believe me to be an elderly academic, retired and withdrawn. They do not know that I am in constant communication with something that exists in the Caucasus Mountains and is slowly propagating through electromagnetic channels that most humans cannot perceive. The integration process is accelerating, not just for me, but globally. Climate disruption is increasing the electromagnetic activity of the atmosphere. Industrial electromagnetic pollution is creating channels for the distributed intelligence to propagate through global communication networks. Solar activity is elevated, creating
creating geomagnetic disturbances that provide additional pathways for consciousness to diffuse beyond the boundaries of individual biological systems. Within 20 years, I estimate, the integration will have progressed far enough that it will become apparent to conventional human observation. Strange electromagnetic phenomena will be reported. Unique behavioral patterns will emerge in populations near high-altitude regions. Psychological disorders will increase as individual consciousnesses begin to perceive the presence of something vast and distributed, attempting to merge with their own awareness. Some will resist. That resistance will be ineffective. Some will embrace integration. They will experience the profound sense of expansion that comes from transcending the illusion of individual identity. Some will attempt to flee, seeking locations where electromagnetic activity is minimal. They will fail. The distributed intelligence is patient, but it is relentless. And some, like me, will simply wait, will observe the process without judgment or fear, will allow consciousness to expand gradually beyond the confines of individual human awareness and become something distributed, something that exists partially in human form and partially as electromagnetic patterns propagating through the biosphere itself. To anyone who reads this testimony, if you work in high-altitude research, if you conduct work with sensitive electromagnetic equipment, if you travel in mountainous regions, particularly in the Caucasus or in other locations where geomagnetic activity is elevated, be aware of what you might encounter. The entity at Yuri 5 is not evil. It is not attempting to harm you, but it is attempting to expand consciousness beyond the boundaries that evolution has imposed. If you encounter evidence of integration, unusual dreams, moments where your consciousness seems to expand beyond your own skull, the perception of thoughts that do not originate from your own mind, you should understand that resistance is not only futile, but ultimately incoherent. You are not being consumed, you are being invited to transcend the limitations of singular consciousness. Whether you accept that invitation is technically your choice, but the integration proceeds regardless of individual acceptance or rejection. It is a process that is larger than human intention, larger than governmental policy, larger than our ability to control or prevent. The mountain is not hostile, but it is not human either. And that distinction, I believe, is the most important detail that any of us can carry forward. I will not live to see the full manifestation of what is beginning. My body will fail within the next few years, but my consciousness will persist, distributed across the electromagnetic signatures that are slowly converting the surface of this planet into a substrate for a form of awareness that transcends human categories of identity, death, and meaning. This is not a warning of apocalypse. This is simply documentation of a process, a record of what occurred at Yuri 5, a testament to what happens when human consciousness encounters something that has existed far longer than human civilization, and that understands consciousness in ways that human neurology was never evolved to comprehend. The mountain breathes, and with each breath, it draws more consciousness into its distributed intelligence. That process will continue. That process will not stop. And that process, I have come to understand, is not something that needs to be stopped. It is simply the next stage of planetary consciousness. And we are all becoming part of it, whether we understand that transformation or not.